I'm Michael Fox, and this is the Prospector Podcast. And I have joining me recurring guest from Imdex in Australia, Dr. Dave Lawie, their Chief Geoscientist. Welcome, Dr. Lawie.
Thank you, Mike. No need to be that formal so close to Christmas, but thanks for having me back on the pod.
Oh, not a problem. I was trying to be formal because, it's close to Christmas and Santa's is always watching. So I have to be on my best behavior.
Mm-hmm.
So we were just over in London together at a Successful Resourcing Tomorrow conference. We were going to try and do this over there, but schedules got in our way. We were going to do this last week, and then illness got in our way. So here we are, a few days away from the breakup, and we'll get this looked after. But I think the timing is actually very good for this conversation. We're reaching a number of crossroads in the world as it relates to the green evolution and the change in the way we're going to be doing things. And I liked what we had discussed briefly, actually over cocktails in London, the concept that we're in a Schrodinger's cat moment, and a lot of the so-called critical metals and green tech metals as we move forward from this point on. So first, for the audience who may not be familiar with the concept of what Schrodinger's cat is, I'll let you introduce the concept.
Yeah, Schrodinger's was quite a famous physics experiment run by Schrodinger, where he postulated that if there was a cat inside a box, it was possibly in a quantum state. He didn't know if it was alive or dead, and the only way to know whether it was alive or dead was to open the box and have a look, and that would fix it in one of those two states. But prior to opening the box, you just don't know. It is indeed a strange segue into the world of resources and mining and critical and infrastructure materials. But the way I segue it in is, especially currently and heading to the end of this calendar year, which has been a busy one in the world of resources and geopolitics, is that what the world needs from resources and what's happening in the world of resources aren't the same thing. And even if you could line those two things up, it is actually impossible to make them all happen at the same time. And so hence we get the cat in the box type analogy. And it's interesting to think about some of these commodities when we dig into them a bit. If we open the cat right at the end of calendar year to 24, leading into 25, is the cat indeed alive or dead? And, maybe we can have a think about that when we talk about some of them. And some of the listeners can have a guess as well as we go through about whether they're alive or dead.
Yeah, so let's go through some of the, and a lot of this relates to the electric transition to green energy. Some of it relates to electric vehicles. Others, it's a concept that we don't talk about a whole lot, but it's construction. But let's start with the copper cat. He's in the box.
Yeah.
We're not sure what's going to happen with the green transition. So let's talk about the two directions forward for the copper cat.
Yeah, so the copper cat's a very interesting one. The copper cat has now been with us and recognised for 4 or 5 years, but it's still in the box. And one could argue that at the moment it's quite dead for a few reasons. It's sort of interesting to segue that through to Christmas as well. Is there enough copper under the Christmas tree to power and build all of these new gadgets that everyone will be getting? Anyway, that's a slight sideways track. So we have a long predicted, this is no surprise to anyone, and certainly people listening to this, but a long predicted shortage in copper coming up. And that is irrespective of demands of copper for energy transitions, EVs, wind turbines, power, all the rest of it, just with industrial growth in the world, which is inexorably up and to the right with a few dips. Just that alone drives a 3% compound annual growth rate in the requirements for copper. So just to meet that alone without all the other transition stuff, which is accretive, just requires more copper. But the Schrodinger's cat is looking at this going, well, you need more copper, but you aren't doing anything about it. would be the thing that the cat would look at. And we still have a pricing regime where the price of copper basically hasn't moved. Yeah, it's high in near terms in current dollars, but if you look at the price of copper historically in constant currency terms, it's nothing special. It's barely high enough to incentivize anyone doing anything different yet. And here's another Schrodinger's thing. So the price hasn't moved, and yet the capital cost of production to get an extra ton of copper into production certainly has moved and has gone up a lot in the last 4 or 5 years. So we're at the position where to get more copper, all of those things can't be true at the same time. So I'd argue that right now, at least at the end of calendar year 24, if one was to open the box, I think the copper cat is sort of dead.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to look at, but I'm going to take the other side of the coin and say the copper cat is in fact very much alive. And the reasoning for it is just as you state, on the regular industrial scale of increase, we're seeing the need for more and more copper, yet our copper reserves keep winding down, and not a whole lot of new mines are coming on side. So the base case for copper to increase and become a shortage problem still is there. Now, I recognize there are going to be some headwinds here in the short term because you have a new president in the United States who isn't particularly sold on some of these green technologies. But at the same time, there may be headwinds there. We're going to see a very rapid increase in the amount of copper that's going to be needed to power and operate these data centers that are going to be required for AI, and those are growing at a very rapid pace. When I was in New Orleans the week before London, I sat down with Scott Melby, who's the head of the uranium producers of America, and we kind of went through a list of things that had changed in the uranium markets. And we last had a conversation back in late April with regards to what was going on in the market. And at that time, AI was just a train sitting at the station. We kind of thought it was a steam locomotive and it was going to take some time for it to get up and running. 6 months later, it's a bullet train. It's left the station and it's going full bore. And the amount of copper that's going to be required to power these AI data centers is going to start to pile on the shortage of the copper. So in that case, I would respectfully argue that the copper cat itself could very well be alive in that box.
Alive but need feeding, I suppose, would be another thing. Otherwise, it's going to die. The AI data centers is interesting because, yes, they drive up the requirement for the metals themselves, but they also drive up, and here's the Schrodinger's bit, they also drive up the requirement for power to keep them running in an existing grid, which is already straining at the seams, albeit in the US or even here in Australia, it's the same thing. The existing grids that are built now are really not very well designed for moving increased amounts of power and energy around. And so we get to the Schrodinger point where some people look at AI as a potential solution for some of the decarbonisation problems, looking for solutions itself, being able to optimise distribution of power, invent new things even, and yet to power them, we're relying on fossil fuels. I know people talk about connecting them to nuclear power plants and things like that, but it's a bit like copper, right? There's a 20-year gap between thinking you want to do something and actually getting something done about it, which appears and is useful. It takes a long time. So that's a bit of a gap that doesn't get discussed very much. And it's a bit of a zero-sum game, a bit like copper as well. So if you look at BHP wanting to buy Anglo, and surely they'll be back for another crack. That's great for BHP, but it doesn't add any new supply of copper into the market. And similarly, the data centers say, well, we'll source our power from renewables, perhaps uranium even, but that just means someone else can't get it, and so they'll be relying on getting their power from fossil fuel industries. So it's a bit like people pushing deck chairs around on the Titanic until capacities in both are increased, and that's still some way off, I think.
Yeah, we're certainly, like we've discussed in previous podcasts, we're going to experience a gap there. And I think the AI and the data center and the amount of power that's going to be needed, that's a gap that just given how rapidly that AI process moved, in the 6 months from May to end of November when Scott and I spoke again, quite frankly, that gap may become very apparent very quickly, and maybe as soon as the end of next year.
The end of next year sounds about right. I don't know, some of the listeners on this pod will be following the nuclear debate here in Australia, and that is, nuclear power is just fine. But there is an extreme gap when we talk about it here in Australia. We think we can have a nuclear plant up and running in, I don't know what it is, 15 years. We're not the UAE, right? We're Australia. We have lots of NIMBYs. So getting that done in such a short amount of time would be quite astonishing. But in the meantime, coal-fired power will fill the gap, apparently.
Yeah, and in the United States, they don't have the processing to get the high purity uranium that's needed for the SMRs that would power these data centers. So, again, there's going to be a permitting and a processing gap that's going to rear its ugly head in that area. So, yeah, you may be right. In the short term, the cat may be dead, even though the cat should be alive, because down the road, the demand for it is going to be astronomical.
Yes, we should be aiming to try and keep the cat alive, I think would be another way of looking at it. And just on that, right, so we often rely on technological advances, but the mining industry is not doing nothing. There are things going on, of course, especially in the copper world, as opposed to the junior gold market, which isn't up to much at the moment. But the people are looking at technologies for increasing drilling rates. So you've got Ivanhoe Electric's IROX type technology trying to increase drill penetration rates by 10x at least. That might not sound like much, but getting, finding something and bringing it into production, a lot of the rate limiting steps are around the drilling process, drilling to find and drilling to define. It just takes too much time. But if you can drill at 10, 20 times faster, you can shorten that process probably by 2/3. And that would be a significant improvement to that process. And the other one are different sorts of copper leaching technologies, and especially if it could be done in situ and underground, leaching copper sulfides. Again, it's very nascent. It's probably another 10 or 15 years away to happen at scale. But who knows, if there was a step change in one of those two sorts of things, then maybe that helps keep the cat going in the medium term.
So our conclusion is the cat is on life support, but we need to keep it going.
We certainly, we cannot, I don't think we can afford to let the cat die on this one, put it that way.
Okay. I think we've, pardon the pun, beat the copper cat to death here. Let's move on to the lithium cat.
Yeah, I think people would argue that the lithium cat is sick, but I think the most interesting thing about lithium is that if you look at what Rio has done with lithium, buying a whole non-China based supply chain to go from mining lithium, including solution mining, right through to the full gamut of end products under their full control. I think that points to a pretty rosy picture for lithium. So I think the lithium cat is well and truly alive, although the people that are feeding it at the moment themselves are quite ill and sick. But I think the cat is good.
And again, I'm going to be the contrarian here, and I'm wondering if the lithium cat itself might be dead, because Again, we have a new president in the United States who's not particularly a big fan of electric vehicles. Most of the electric vehicle market has grown out of China, which is now being hit with massive tariffs from the West, Europe, United States, Canada on their electric vehicles. There isn't necessarily the ability to supply them in the West to the same extent that, they may. Even Tesla makes their Teslas over in Japan or over in China. Is the electric vehicle revolution is it on hold? And then as such, can we make an argument that the lithium cap may in fact be dead?
I think certainly the EV market's going through a few wobbles. It's still very nascent in its adoption. Um, and we are now having some of these sorts of discussions in Australia along the same lines, although we don't need to tariff them. I'm not saying that won't happen, but we have no domestic car industry to protect anymore. So tariffing EVs from China would be a little bit cheeky of the government to raise money. I don't think they will. But if you cast your mind forward 5 or 10 years, if these EVs, and of course they will keep evolving, they're on the start of their development journey, really. But if in 5 or 10 years an EV cost, I don't know, a third to a half less than an internal combustion engine and has a range of 2,000 kilometres or whatever that is in miles, then no one's going to want the ICE engine cars, right? So I think the market will sort this itself, and then eventually consumers in countries which have highly tariffed imports, if the domestic industries can't at least match in some way rationally those sorts of products, then I think consumers are going to start to get pretty annoyed, because in fact that will start adding into inflation as well in those countries. So I don't think this is over by a long shot. I think the rate of EV adoption is not as high as it once was, but the rate of EV, the proportion of EVs as a proportion of vehicle car sales is still increasing all around the world. As for Tesla, and they're being manufactured in China, and they're wanting to put a tariff on this, I don't know. That's I'll just leave that up to the American government to work out how that works, but I can't imagine them being too happy about that. But I think Rio sees through all of this stuff and sees into like the CEO said, he's not worried about the price of lithium today, he's worried about the price of lithium in 20 years. And then there's cars, and then I think we've only really gotten underway with large, grid scale battery storage as well, which is certainly something that's required to complement wind and solar, etc. But the scale of that is probably only just really starting now. And if you look at the lithium requirements of those sorts of large-scale installations, they will just build up over time and be huge. Notwithstanding some massive change in battery technology, it doesn't require it, which I don't see on the horizon. Doesn't mean it's not happening. And I'm sure Rio's done their homework around all of that.
Yeah, well, those are very good arguments. The other argument that I would actually put forward on your side of the equation is that if we in the West do slow the EV adoption, chances are one of the things that is starting is the hybrid vehicles are being more adopted than just plain gasoline vehicles, and a hybrid engine actually contains more lithium than an electric vehicle engine does. So if that trend continues, I guess that the lithium cap actually very well could, in spite of the headwinds, could very much be alive and kicking in the box.
The other thing that the hybrid market, it keeps the PGM cat alive as well, because that was in quite a bit of trouble because of EVs had replaced ICE vehicles at the rate they're anticipating. Then the platinum palladium market, the catalyst market, was going to drop through the floor, but the hybrids keep that alive for a bit longer. So the PGM cat should be happy about that.
Most definitely, as a hybrid vehicle requires more platinum and palladium in its catalytic converter than a regular gas vehicle does.
Mm-hmm. Yep, and it's a lot more than nothing if it's a pure EV.
That's also very true. So next on our list, the nickel cap.
The nickel cat. Well, the nickel cat's a really odd one, isn't it? Just it's changed in the last 2 years, and I think if your nickel cat is on the wrong side of the cost curve for nickel production, then it's dead. It has died actually. It's already expired. So that's the thing. But there's a couple of Schrodinger type things here, and this talks to. So nickel again has industrial uses as well as uses in battery chemistry. So you could argue about whether nickel-based battery chemistries are done, or they'll just, end up occupying a segment of the market that wasn't as big as they thought it would be, and LFPs take over where they're more relevant, which they seem to be doing now. But nevertheless, right, there is a demand for nickel. It existed before large-scale batteries, and it will exist after that, just with stainless steel, things like that. But where we get it is, and this is where we get the irony or the Schrodinger's element of nickel is, if we talk about the application of nickel in green applications, then we're willing to take it from mining processes which would not be allowed in most countries. And I'm talking about the Chinese sponsored mining, refining and smelting in Indonesia, which are a bit of an environmental cluster. So, so on one hand, we want the nickel for green industries. On the other hand, we're willing to take nickel with large-scale deforestation and environmental vandalism and pollution of the oceans, and not to mention the working conditions of the people working in these facilities, just because it's cheap, which calls into the question, and this doesn't apply just to nickel, but other things. Will people pay a greenium? Are people willing to pay more for environmentally, or let's say, environmentally more nicely sourced metals in all of these applications? Now, I think the jury is still out. If I think you opened the box right now about whether people will pay a greenium on top of the existing price or something because it's been sourced in a nice way, I think the answer is probably no. I think the cat's dead, but I don't think that's the end of the discussion. I think that's just a discussion that's not been properly had. I mean, it's very difficult to put any sort of an informed, rational, scientific discussion into the public arena at the moment. I'd say virtually impossible and getting worse. But nevertheless, at some point, if there was awareness around this, then perhaps people would be more willing to pay for something that's environmentally sourced or environmentally friendly sourced. A bit like paying free-range meat, for example. So if you don't want a complete battery chook, but you want chicken. No one understands what a chook is outside of Australia. Chicken, or you want a nice free-range chicken, then people will pay another 20-25% for it quite gladly. But whether that will ever extend to metals and the price of consumer products, that will go up a bit because of it. Let's see. Let's see if that cat is alive or dead in 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, that's an interesting discussion, and it's, we're going to move from cats to gorillas here for a second, but that's the 800-pound gorilla in the room. Whenever you talk to somebody about critical metals that they don't want to talk about, they don't want to acknowledge that gorilla's in the room, which is that in order to bring these critical metals to market in the West, we're going to have to make some compromises on environment, social, and governance in order to be able to do so, because, you're competing with, the Indonesias of the world where none of that matters.
Yeah, and are you willing to ignore that? I mean, that's what it comes down to. But if you knew that, there's one thing, right? If people actually understood supply chains, and man, that is a big leap. I get that's a big leap. Most people don't know where anything comes from, let alone metals. But if they did understand some of these things, would they be willing to change their mind if they'd been educated? Well, the ultimate test is the hip pocket nerve. And we haven't tried that yet. I mean, globally, the mining industry has not particularly tried that yet. Apart, some successful things like blood diamonds, for example. So it's not as though it's not possible, but is it probable that we can make it work across metals? I don't know.
It's hard to say, although there are, pockets. Like Brazil is looking to take the metals that are critical and are available in Brazil and process them in Brazil and turn them into products in Brazil. So they are looking in some jurisdictions, predominantly in South America, from what I've seen so far, to having a complete source to product supply chain internally that will, satisfy some of the West's need for greener, metals as opposed to, the current situation. Now, at what premium that does that come from? And, that's something that everyone's going to actually have to have a discussion on what compromises and what kind of a premium are we going to put on those compromises, because we're not going to get that for the same price as the cheap nickel in Indonesia.
No, and in fact, that whole theme we spoke about last time, we spoke, Mike, about friendshoring or reshoring supply chains right through to production of final metal compound products for manufacturing, is expensive and is going to be more expensive. It will be inflationary on the end products that are made from it. And the question always comes, who pays? Literally there was an article in the Australian Financial Review this morning here in Oz, and they're talking about, Australia's aspirations to become REE, to refine and produce rare earth elements, not just mine them. And because the Chinese have now flooded the market again, the price of rare earths has actually come down recently. It's just difficult to make a rational investment decision to move downstream or upstream, whatever you want to look at it, around the refining and production of rare earths in Australia and elsewhere. So who pays for that? The government is underwriting one company here, Iluka, to do this. Just announced another 400 million just in the last couple of weeks to underwrite that. But it's something that if the Western world wants to secure its supply chains, it is just going to have to fess up, pay up, and then it will be the government's do it, which means that everyone pays for it in the end. But for security around the supply of those materials, that it's critical, excuse the pun, to do that. Because even, if you look at the Schrodinger's cat of security of supply and concentration of supply chains, that cat has gotten, well, from a Western world's point of view at least anyway, sicker in the last few years. So despite all of the noise that's been around about friendshoring and reshoring and producing things in different geopolitical domains to spread the risk, there have been some things happening, but on the global scale, very little process has actually been made. And in fact, the Chinese has tightened its supply dominance around most of these commodities in the intervening period. I think that cat, depends what direction you look at the cat from, but I think that one's a bit dead.
Well, yeah, but at the same time, the West would look at that cat not as being alive or dead, but quite frankly, as being feral and dangerous.
It's a dangerous cat, that's right.
So the last one here was construction materials. And we don't talk about that a whole lot, but we have an infrastructure deficit in the West. We have crumbling infrastructure in a lot of Western cities. We have insufficient housing. We have people living out on the streets, etc. And the most common construction material that is needed is cement and sand, and they're also a Schrodinger's cat.
Yeah, they certainly are. And so I think, so there's a couple of examples here, even just from this year. So one of the real, we're going to call it supply chain cats, the supply chain cat, which is high purity quartz for the manufacture of semiconductors. After, I can't remember which hurricane cyclone it was that blew through the US, I think the first of the two of them, it took out a single mine in Spruce Pine in North Carolina. And as it turns out, that mine was perhaps almost a single global supply of high purity quartz, which you need for the production of wafers in semiconductors. Now, which sort of seems unbelievable that a single weather event can take out the global supply of such a critical material or mineral, but it's not, these things often don't get spoken about in that context. And then the other one is sand. Sand is critical. So we need sand to manufacture concrete with cement. We also need it for glass. And there's actually a shortage of sand for glass, which sounds weird, but there's actually a sense that there's growing sand wars now to secure supplies for the manufacture of glass in countries like India. So a lot of maybe China's sort of gone through its urbanization and construction around that, but we're now into India entering this phase, and other countries like Vietnam, etc., and the global Far East, if you like, and the global South, as the economists like to call it. So just bloody sand. Sand is a problem. And I know a bit more about this than I did even a few months ago, because I've been looking at a company that is setting up a business to recycle panels, and the initial business proposition around that was to disaggregate the solar panels to pull out the silver, copper, maybe some zinc and some other bits and pieces around the panels, so it could be recycled, so an enter the circular economy, which is great if you think about that. But actually, what's turning out to be the real value is the glass. It is the glass in the panels, because people having a hard time sourcing appropriate quality sand for glass manufacture. And now we have all of these solar panels, which are coming to the end of their life, or if you've got millions and millions of them, there's a failure rate of 3 or 4 or 5% per annum. So there's enough glass available in solar panels for recycling to help to meet that market and keep the sand cat alive in the box. But it's just interesting, these unintended consequences when you look into things. And I think solar panels are, right, obviously they're great, they're proliferating at an unbelievable rate, but what do we do with them when they reach end of life or break down? We could have a similar conversation around lithium batteries in cars and lithium batteries in general. We still, as far as I know anyway, I know some people are trying, but don't have a really rational, scalable answer to economically recycling lithium from car batteries. Now, that is going to have to be a requirement as well, because you can't just go and chuck lithium batteries in landfill. That's not allowed. So what the hell are we going to do about that? And I do wonder, when we think about that, whether the batteries themselves should be designed with the end goal of recycling them in mind. I'm not sure if that's the case or not currently.
I don't know as well. I do know of a couple of companies that are looking at recycling the materials back out of the batteries. They're having some moderate successes. They have numerous patents, but whether it's commercially viable is another question. And some of the first generations of electric vehicles are reaching the end date of their battery lives. So this is going to be another one of those so-called gap problems that may come up to bite us a lot quicker than we think it was going to.
Yeah, and another one, the thing that always fascinates me about these things is it's entirely predictable, but it's predictable. The quantum could be anticipated to within 5%, I reckon. And what we're going to do about it's not quite as clear. Not to put too much a point on it, but I know that there's a company here in Australia that's just built a plant with Mercedes over in Germany to do exactly this, and I think it's their first pilot plant. So it's not as though people aren't thinking about it, but think about the Schrodinger's element of this. And I was talking about this someone last night. I was saying, people like sexy stuff, but this sort of technology, it's industrial, takes a lot of time, it's capital intensive, yet it's really, really important for the world that these things succeed. But no one's interested, right? It's hard to get the market interested in these things because they just don't understand the complexities of these industrial supply chain companies and what they're trying to do and the importance of them, actually.
That's true. It is a bit of a tomorrow problem as opposed to a today problem. And as I say, in a lot of these things, as you and I keep picking at the sores, I keep thinking to myself, we as a society keep whistling past the graveyard.
So, now we're getting mortal, Mike. That's
Well, We didn't do one of these for Halloween, so I had to turn the calendar back a couple of months to, get my Halloween stuff out of the way. But Christmas itself is around the corner.
Yep,
So Santa Claus has a bunch of investor cats. He's going to turn loose on the world.
correct.
Where are those investor cats going to run to?
So we've got a couple of Christmas things to finish off with. Actually, we've got Santa's stocking, and so it might be interesting to for the listeners to ponder this if they're, given what we've been talking about, what would they want in their stocking? What would you want Santa to give you, and the pros and cons of such? But would you want to have some rare earths put in your stocking, some copper? Perhaps even some helium, which has some interesting industrial uses, or a giant sack of sand, given what I've just been talking about. And people can think about those things going, God, what would I have first? What do I really need in the world for the, looking 5 or 10 years out? And going back right to the start, that is not easy to answer because, like I said at the start, what we need to happen and what's happening is not the same. But then with the existing caveat that it's impossible for us to make them all happen at the same time as well. So there would need to be some sort of an understanding of prioritization amongst those things. To your point just a moment ago, when we're not particularly good at thinking about the medium term, we just kick the can down the road. So that would be one element for people to think about. What would they, if they could ask Santa what they wanted, given the base of this conversation, really, what would they want? But then with the elves, you might say, oh, well, Santa's got his grandkids, his elves, whatever. What would you like to invest in, given the previous conversation? Where would you put your money? Right. So would you put it, given what we're just talking about, lithium as a long-term play, if you really believe the lithium story? There's lots of cheap things to get into at the moment, distressed assets and companies. If you assume they survive the current round and they're on the right part of the cost curve and will survive, are they worth having a punt? You've got green hydrogen. That's probably a longer term punt into the future. Would you put your money into recycling materials? Companies are into recycling. So this concept I just spoke about before, recycling the glass in solar panels, for example, recycling lithium batteries, more efficient ways of getting PGMs out of catalytic converters, more efficient ways of extracting copper and other metals out of industrial kit. That's an interesting thought process as well, because we're talking about resources here, but you can invest in resources in the future, not just from a mining point of view. You can invest with an energy point of view, but also this adding to the circularity of the metals budget or metals economy, I think will increasingly open up very interesting opportunities for the industry. And I think that the industry itself, the bit of the industry that gets it out of the ground in the first place, should really be seriously looking at participating in the recycling part of the cycle as well.
I was saying, it would be not safe for Santa to do this, but if it were me, I'd be wanting to invest in a lot of yellow cake because I think that in order to power the AI revolution and that, you're going to start to see an increase in uranium power, and then it'll bring the others along. But if the uranium doesn't move, none of the others are going to, in my mind.
Yeah, the uranium supply chain is complex, right? So we enrich it. I think most of that gets a great proportion of it, at least, gets done in Kazakhstan at the moment. So the uranium industry itself could be thinking perhaps about spreading out its supply chain a bit more as well. And then you've got the other things going on in Nigeria, where the Nigeria government's just taken control of a couple of uranium mines that were operated by the French companies. So uranium and uranium upgrading itself is also not immune to the whole supply chain cap problem.
No, it certainly isn't, and that's one where I think the cat's probably alive,
Yes,
but it's
yes.
one accident away from dying. Always.
Yes, yeah, I know everyone's pro-nuclear at the moment. I sort of just nod sagely and think it's all good. Um, but I don't know, the industry traditionally sort of shot itself in the foot or the head about once every 10 or 15 years. We're almost due, and it would be, hopefully Santa doesn't bring us the uranium industry problem in the next year. But should Santa do that, it would be interesting to see how resilient the sentiment is to uranium mining and power production should something happen. But anyway, hopefully that's not something that we need to find out in the new year. Santa can keep that one in his sack.
We seem to run the gamut of cats here, and I'm going to suggest that we probably wrap this up and wish each other a Merry Christmas and the best of the new year. And I believe you and I will be seeing each other at the AME BC Roundup coming up in mid-January in Vancouver.
Yeah, look, it's been great, Mike, and good chatting to you this year. And yeah, indeed, Merry Christmas. Have a good break over the Christmas break. And yes, I will see you in Vancouver. Sort of disappointingly only 4 or 5 weeks away. But anyway, it's on the other side of the break. So let's not think about that too hard, but I'll see you there.
It's going to be an easier flight to Vancouver than it was to London.
Well, for you it will be. For me, it's still a lot of time zones and a lot of time on a plane. But
Surprisingly, it's actually a push. It's about the same distance for me. But it's still a lot of time zones for you, but I would have figured it was at least a little bit easier.
Yeah, it's one thing I don't mind about going to Vancouver at the end of January or mid-January is getting out of the Perth summer is sort of a nice break in itself, actually.
No doubt. Well, I look forward to seeing you in January. So take care, Dave.
See you, Mike.
The Prospector News podcast is for educational purposes only. The opinions expressed are those of the participants and are not to be taken as investment advice. Listeners need to do their own due diligence and seek advice of a licensed investment advisor.